Salisbury, a cathedral city in Wiltshire, situated above the New Forest and below the Northwest Downs. These days, it is more famous for Stonehenge, the cathedral, and the Magna Carta. But as you walk around and look at your surroundings here, you will find a long history full of knights, rebellion, and D-Day. So let's get stuck in to the history of Salisbury. It starts off with a long ongoing argument between the clergy and the military. The move from Old Sarum to Salisbury, that is, the new Salisbury. The previous bishop, Herbert Poor, had apparently tried to relocate the cathedral back in the reign of Richard the Lionheart. This never came into fruition. Further not helped by the interdict imposed by the Pope to combat the tyranny of King John. So it wasn't until 1217 that his brother, Richard Poor, under a different king, Henry III, managed to get permission from the Pope to undergo this famous move. Thus the town of Salisbury moved from the location of the old castle on the hill to the green valley it now occupies. "Let us descend into the plain," cries Peter of Blois, according to legend. Though, if anyone heard Peter say it, there'd be a mass panic. He's been dead 6 years. But move they did, and a site was chosen next to the nearby River Avon. Another legend tells us that this new site was chosen by firing an arrow and seeing where it lands, where apparently it struck a deer who died in the spot where the cathedral now stands. A very fanciful tale indeed, and there is actually an old poem which explores this comically, written by Dr. Walter Pope, released in 1713. This part concerns Richard Poor, who wants to complete his vow to the Pope, and a soldier about to fire the arrow of folklore. The soldier says, "I will lay on the side of my good yewen bow, that I shoot clear over the corn, as far as that cow in Merrifield, which grazes under the thorn." Then the bishop cried out, "Where is Merrifield?" for his mind was still on his vow. Then the soldier replied, "Well, by the riverside, where you see that brindle cow." To begin this colossal project, Richard Poor would require a large amount of workers. He would need architects, masons, bricklayers, carpenters, all kinds of tradies, from smiths to rope makers. Hundreds, if not thousands, of people from start to finish, embarking on a project that could easily take 2 generations, if not more, to complete. The architect in question was the highly skilled master mason Elias of Dereham, who worked closely with the bishop, the perfect man for the job, employing a team of experts to get this mammoth project working. Not much is known about Elias other than he was a fellow churchman, which was common at the time, and that he also designed Clarendon Palace. He would have been a very wealthy man indeed. Also, Elias is the reason the Magna Carta was stored at the cathedral, because he was present when King John signed the famous document at Runnymede in 1215. Sure, it ended up getting annulled, sparking the First Barons' War, but it still held weight. And the current king, Henry III, absolutely held the values of Magna Carta, issuing and signing several more. So stored at the cathedral it was. So yes, Salisbury Cathedral contains an original 1215 draft of the Magna Carta, signed by John, not Henry. There you go. But these days, Elias of Dereham is far from forgotten. In fact, he has a Freemasons lodge dedicated to him, Lodge number 586. His legacy passing down over the years. Though it is easy to date Salisbury to the foundation of the cathedral itself, it is just as easy to forget that the workers who arrived needed places to live before they started working. Right at the start, in around 1219, while this multitude of workers were arriving at the once empty plain, a small shantytown began to appear. Only temporary, as the town itself was already being developed and would follow a grid pattern. These tradies would also require food, drink. They'd also require a church, so a small wooden church was quickly constructed to give the people a place to pray and receive rites. This church is still with us today, although it was later rebuilt using stone and dedicated to St. Thomas in 1238. So you could say that the town erupted overnight, but it's not like there was nothing to draw from. Old Sarum was only up the road, and farms have existed here for centuries, along with smaller villages that have been appearing here and there in the general area. So it's really just a matter of relocating a couple of miles down the road. As for the cathedral, it only exists on parchment. Not a single stone has been laid yet. The first stone of the new St. Mary's Cathedral was laid the next year in 1220. But Rome was not built in a day. The real building began the next year in 1221, and for the next few decades, the entire cathedral would resemble a huge construction site, consisting not only of the cathedral, but areas like the close and various other important buildings. There'd be taverns, alehouses, we've already got the farms, there's all kinds of trades, everything's going very well. Of the alehouses from this early period, it really is hard to ascertain which ones currently remain to this day, because pubs like the Haunch of Venison and the New Inn seem to appear in the 14th century, the 1300s, and not in the form we see them today. Very little remains anyway. The only pub that seems to be around from this early period, this 2020s period, is an inn called the White Bear, that apparently catered for the workers that built the cathedral. It's only up the road. Today, we know it as the Red Lion, but very little, if anything, of that old 13th century structure remains. But that's history for you. Salisbury is not a time capsule. Buildings, names, they change as each generation passes and the decades become centuries. The city has changed dramatically, like every other city, though some of the more ancient features still remain from this early period. Because not all are built in stone. You see, several years later, in 1227, King Henry III would grant this thriving town a market charter. Yes, Salisbury Market is ancient. The Royal Charter allowed the market to be held twice a week, Tuesdays and Saturdays, and has always boasted a large range of trade from butchers and cheesemakers to clothes. You could get the best wool. Even in the town's infancy, where the cathedral was merely a construction site, this town was thriving. There'd be all the local gossip, entertainment, ale and wine, everything. A medieval market, you see, was more than just a shopping spree, and very little has changed. Even now, the Salisbury Market boasts not only a good range of goods, but the occasional live show. I should know, I've been there enough. As you can see, the cathedral itself was proving quite a magnificent sight. It's all coming along nicely. Though, as for Richard Poor, he wouldn't get to see this far into the project, having been sent back up to Durham in 1228, passing away around a decade later. So during the 1230s, it was the new Bishop of Salisbury, Robert de Bingham, who would oversee the project, working alongside Elias. And the nave is beginning to take shape, as the 1230s give way to the 1240s. The choir, the transepts, they're all coming together. Oh, and by the way, it's not all about the bishops, and if you want to know who the dean is during this period, well, after all, he's going to be the one running the cathedral, it's a chap called William de Wanda, but in 1238 he's replaced by Robert de Hertford, which brings me to the close. As it wasn't just the cathedral being built, but the close situated opposite was coming along together also. Consisting of opulent buildings owned by the church. I mean, after all, the dean wasn't a pauper, and would be required to live in a manner fit for his station, along with other clergymen, all living together in a small community. Now, somewhere between November 1249 to February 1250, and yes, timbers have been dated with this much accuracy, we have the construction of a deanery. Now, the dean at the time would have been Robert de Hertford, as this was his residence, and it still has some of the original wooden beams on the roof. Around 30% of the woodwork is original, dating back to around the 1250 mark. Good oak trusses, and the roof itself could be one of the earliest examples of its style. Here, you were just seeing the hall, but there would have been a solar, which is the living quarters, accessed by a spiral staircase. There was a door leading to a buttery, another leading to the pantry, and a third door leading to the domestic rooms. It even boasted a well, still does. This place is much larger than we give credit. There's also a place for an open hearth, and evidence of a smoke hole in the ceiling. You can see the raised area where the high table was set, an opulent hall worthy of the dean. He's no doubt hogging the salt. More importantly, due to the way they did the trusses, they needed no pillars. You have nothing but uninterrupted floor space here. Very useful in the feasts of the Middle Ages. So, we have the cathedral, the close, which covers the lands to the west of it, all the way to the River Avon. These appear to be the parts prioritised, and once these parts were underway, the town itself was built to the north. As we know, the town followed more or less a grid pattern, most likely centred on the market square I spoke of earlier. Roads running right up to the gate that leads to the cathedral and the close. Roads like New Street, which was known by that name even in the 13th century, and also included modern-day Crane Street. You've got Endless Street, Catherine Street, Exeter Street. Sure, some names have changed over the years, but they pretty much followed the same route as they did back then. If you had a time machine and travelled back, you could probably make your way around once you've got your bearings, because the buildings certainly changed. Right now, they're rows of timber-framed 13th century buildings leading straight onto a dirt track, no tarmac, no pavement. But they were still the same streets nonetheless. Though 51 Blue Ball Row, which you see here, isn't 13th century, it's 16th century, but it gives you an example of what you'd expect. St Thomas's Chapel, that little affair rebuilt in 1238, well, in 1248 it was rebuilt once again, also of stone, where it is documented as a church proper. So it's clear that more people are flocking to Salisbury, creating the need for larger spaces to worship. And Salisbury isn't anywhere near as big as it is now, obviously. Pretty much confined to the area known then as Merryfield. I'm guessing from Mary's Field. Not far from that brindle cow. An area that consisted pretty much of St Mary's Cathedral, the Close, and as far as New Canal, and as far west as St Martin's Church. Not big at all by our standards. Well, at least this seems to be the original plan, as it actually pushes up past New Canal. That's where you find the market place and St Thomas's Church. And around 1249, Merryfield is divided up into 4 distinctive wards. New Street Ward, Martin's Ward, Meads Ward, and Market Ward. So you can see how this city is planning out. And St Thomas's Church, as I said, is all the way back up there in Market Ward. No doubt the busiest area of town, with the construction site of the cathedral going on south of all this, along with the Close. Now you can see what I'm driving at when I say if you travelled back, you'd know where you were. Unfortunately, other than the cathedral and some of the buildings within the Close, no 13th century buildings still stand in the city. But some have their memory retained, like Mitre House. Even though it is long gone, it is still remembered in the designs. And it is not just buildings that only remain in memory, because Robert de Bingham will pass away. The bishopric of Salisbury, following through William of York and then Giles of Bridport, who oversees the completion of the cathedral, which happens in 1258. Well, completed enough anyway. There was still a lot of work to do. The chapter house won't be added until the 1260s, but at least the main body is up, the choir, nave and transept. We would have recognised it. And what a magnificent job they did too. Kings are also not immortal, and in 1272 Henry III passes away, and his son Edward I, Longshanks, takes the throne. And we can't really mention him without mentioning Scotland. Because in 1286, the Scottish king, Alexander III, dies in an accident while riding his horse, at night and in bad weather. No comment. But suddenly, the crown of Scotland finds itself in crisis. He has no surviving male heirs, only a granddaughter, Margaret, who is also the daughter of the King of Norway. But why is all this relevant? Well, because the Scottish ambassadors headed to Salisbury to meet with King Edward I for the Treaty of Salisbury. Here, the idea being, secure the future of Scotland's crown by marrying Margaret off to a good suitor. But it's not easy. She's only 3 years old, and she won't even live past the age of 7. The Scottish throne is in a perilous position indeed. But we pretty much know the history from there, and no, don't watch Braveheart. Avoid Braveheart at all costs. It's as historically accurate as Land Before Time. I'll go further, because Land Before Time at least has some parts of accuracy. Braveheart doesn't. Right. And our concern is on the city of Salisbury as it enters the 14th century. In the last year of Edward Longshanks' reign, 1307, Aside from the marketplace itself, there were 4 market crosses erected in the town. Out of these 4, only one remains today, and that is Fair Cross, or as we know it, the Poultry Cross. Now, right back in the previous century, even as far as the 1230s, the market area had been very busy. It appears that market days pretty much happened every day. A lot of traffic passed through this area, so it made sense to put up a market cross. This also allowed segregation of various trades into certain areas. All the trade you could want. Oh, he knows all the Polari. Other areas would be Whelan Row, where you would find the wheel makers. You had a Bottle Row, where you would find the bottles, and Potterware, or the crockery and pottery. All a stone's throw from the market square. You would find Fish Row, Butcher's Row, all of which exist today. Ox Row, you can tell just by their names what they would sell. There'd be not much confusion as to what wares were being hawked at Butcher's Row. It's a thriving market area, and no doubt with an alehouse or two. Though of course by now the river was no use drawing water from, as it had long become polluted by waste, offal and other misadventures. Wells would be the preferred way of drawing water. And round the corner from the market and opposite the Poultry Cross is what is now the Halter Venison pub, hailing from the reign of Edward II, 1320, though it wouldn't have been a pub back then. But it is where the building's history begins, and like most things, it has been altered drastically over the years. But going back to markets and trade, the main trade here was cloth. But that is a bit of a cop-out, as many cities and towns were known for their cloth. Overall, textiles were very much a booming trade over the kingdom, especially in Salisbury. Cloth. It is easy to summarise it in that one little word, cloth. So what's cloth? Well, there's wool for a start. Still, details often get overlooked when people simply state, our town was good for wool. So let's go deeper. Those farms we know on the outskirts, overseen by manors, are all a part of the ebb and flow of medieval life. Places like the plains and the meadows, you could see for miles the furlongs of the agricultural lands, dotted by farmhouses and the like. Among the corn and the barley, you would see sheep grazing here and there from one of the many sheep farms in the area. You'll also need flax for linen, and here you have flax in abundance, and all this is contributing to the textile industry that will only grow with each passing year. Still, we're not talking about a global effort here. It is still very localised, at least to this part of the West Country, primarily making clothes for themselves and nearby areas. And tailors made up around 10% of Salisbury's entire population, a trend that will go on until around 1350. On a different note, Edward II will call a parliament here in 1324, so this is not the middle of nowhere. The town has been going on for around 100 years by now, and no one alive can remember the first stone laid at the cathedral. And by now, you've got the chapter house, the cloisters, just about everything you'd expect. Well, except the clock, but we'll get to that in a minute. And Parliament is called again by the next king, Edward III, in 1328. He's only been on the throne a year following the Despenser War, which saw the death of his father, Edward II. Now, I said earlier that outside the close and the cathedral, pretty much nothing remains today. But to be honest, little remains in the close too, because back in the 13th and 14th centuries, you had several buildings that are not even around anymore. Quite a few, in fact. There was Leadenhall, an old canonry built for Elias of Derham. It's now the grounds of a school, so no, I took no footage of that. But there was another canonry built later, around the same time as the older deanery, sort of 1250s, and neither existing in any recognisable form today. You do have Hemingsby, built during the early 14th century, another canonry. The close has more cannons than HMS Victory. Anyway, jokes aside, a part of this building does remain. It's the old bit to the right of the modern one. You can see it here. So again, if you travelled back, there would be familiarities, especially in the close. And that old deanery will also undergo an expansion during this period, because now you only see the hall. But like I said earlier, it once had service rooms, kitchens and stuff. It's also got its own chapel. Big place. Recent developments are the creation of the Arundels, which is built during the reigns of Edward I and Edward II. But even that's a far cry from what it is today. The main noticeable change to Salisbury that is still visible today, around this period, is a new stone gate built guarding the entrance of the close, North Gate. It's built during the 1320s, but it would take sort of roughly 20 years to fully complete, and even boasted a small prison for scallywags who committed misdeeds within the clergy of the close. Now originally, that statue was of King Henry III, but Edward VII decided that he'd be a better candidate for Salisbury, so it now displays him. My interest is more on that bear. Bishop Bear of Salisbury, I'll call him. It sounds better than the Bear Bishop. Anyway, moving on. More development was undertaken in the 1330s in the form of the wall that surrounds this area, using stone from the old cathedral that still remained at Old Sarum, several miles away, the old building taken down completely. The wall, like everything else, has undergone many repairs and changes over the years, but at its heart it is still the same wall built back in the 1330s during the reign of Edward III, and it's him that greenlit the project in the first place, so to speak. Now, as you can see, the wall forms a sort of square around the cathedral and the close, accessed by a number of gates, and I've just walked through Harnham Gate, which you saw a moment ago, where those two chaps were walking by. I then turned left and headed up Exeter Street. And just look at the stonework. Around halfway, you'll reach Bishopsgate, but unless you have clearance, you are not getting in from there. And in the 14th century, the area behind that wall was very much reserved for the clergy. If you cross the road, you can see the cathedral spire, towering over the city, a prominent feature of Salisbury. I mean, we're used to tall buildings, but the average person in the 14th century wouldn't be. To them, this is a wonder. Though to us it's a wonder as well, it's a beautiful building. And soon you'll get to St Anne's Gate. Another names not down, not coming in affair. You certainly get the idea that the church was isolating itself from the rest of the city. Certainly looks like it. They've got their own feasting halls, chapels, a whole hierarchy of clergy. And given the church had its own rules of law, separated from the common law, for lack of a better term, Salisbury was certainly an interesting city. Like a kind of Catholic castle, with the cathedral as the keep, kept behind walls. Meanwhile, the nobility, though it's fading out of popularity, are still up at Old Sarum. Anyway. So we're going to press on up St John Street and round the corner, sort of heading left, into New Street, which isn't as new as it once was, but the name is still with us. And before long, you'll arrive at the Wigan Quill. And no, the Wigan Quill is not a quill from Wigan. It's a pub. Chances of that, eh? But We're not here for the wig and quill, we're here for the New Inn. Sure, the pub itself is from the 16th century, but the buildings that make up this pub go back as far as the 14th. I say buildings because look at this, it's a window. It was once part of a different structure. Whatever replaced the old 14th century houses that once stood here would have been built on pre-existing structures. And this site's been here since Henry III and Richard Paul. Old timber structures that would have been replaced over the past century. But I don't know much about the pub from this point in time. I just fancied a pint. Though I wonder how much of the old 14th century timber remains. In my York series, I skipped the Black Death, and I will do here, for the simple reason that nothing is known in Salisbury or up there. We don't know numbers, we don't know its impact. All we do know is that in 1348 it had already ravaged Europe, and now it entered England from the west, arriving in Bristol and sweeping east across the kingdom, hitting Salisbury and other areas before striking London. That's all we know. Given that around a third of Europe was slain, pretty much, the Reaper leaving countless of dead in its wake, Salisbury must have suffered, but we can only speculate. More is written about crop failures, like the Great Famine of 1314, where even King Edward II couldn't get bread. And famines were frequent during the 14th century. We just know bugger all about the Black Death. What we do know is that by 1358, Salisbury had picked up again and trade was seemingly back to normal, or at least to sensible levels. And again, that's all we know. But we do have a hospital emerge in 1350, Trinity Hospital, which is still going today. And following all this, Salisbury was one of the largest cities in the kingdom. It was flourishing. When it comes to the overall kingdom, as we know, Edward III is on the throne. A long war with France is also underway, starting in the 1330s and dragging on right until the 1370s. It'll go on a lot longer. This is the 100 Years' War. Even worse was the death of the heir apparent, known as Edward the Black Prince, most likely acquiring the nickname due to his famous black shield and his brutal reputation in Aquitaine, France. Either way, he was dead by 1376, leaving the monarchy in a bit of a pickle. But rather than go on a large tangent, let's just say the king will choose the Black Prince's son, Richard, over the king's other sons, men like John of Gaunt. Now, the 100 Years' War was expensive, and several poll taxes were called over its course. One was in 1377, which brings us back to Salisbury, because here, if you were over the age of 14, you'd pay a 4-penny poll tax. Of course, the clergy were exempt from this, as were vagabonds, but everybody else had to pay this tax. And it gives us a clue as to the population, because 3,326 taxpayers are recorded, so you can get a rough guess of between 5,000 to 6,000 residents living here in 1377. Now, given they've been hammered by the Black Death some years prior, I think we can safely say the city has recovered. And later that year, the king was dead, and his grandson, Richard, took the throne. He's only 10 years old, meaning his uncle, John of Gaunt, gets to hoggle the power. So politically, the kingdom is in a bit of a pickle. Because the king doesn't like this affront to his royal prerogative of power. And as time moves on, Richard II gets increasingly more despotic. But taxes, like I mentioned earlier, as well as a whole host of economic tensions, lead to a peasants' revolt in 1381. The rebels caused much destruction, especially in London, when that's in London, and the now teenage King Richard II agrees to meet with the rebel leader Wat Tyler, and among the magnates that accompanied the king was the Earl of Salisbury, William Montagu. But outside of the title, he has no real connection with the city. And as for the discussion with the rebel leader Wat Tyler, well, violence broke out and he is killed in a melee, soon after beheaded, and his head put on a nice spike for all to see. Many rebels are also rounded up and executed, and that's pretty much the gist of it. Now, King Richard II will call a parliament in 1384, which is once again held in Salisbury. That's 3 times in a century. Not too bad, eh? And in 1386, at the cathedral, there's a new mechanical clock. It's long been replaced, but you can see the original one in the nave of the cathedral itself, and it's quite impressive, and it's one of the oldest of its kind that remains. It works on the crown wheel principle, and would have been situated in the tower, striking bells that could be heard all over the city. But these days, not so much. Now, Richard II was an awful king, accused of being a tyrant by his magnates. The 100 Years' War is still dragging on, and there is even a threat of a French invasion. But it's not like the French are having any luck with kings either, as Charles is mentally unstable and falls into psychotic episodes. But in England, there were many years of political unrest, and in 1399, John of Gaunt is dead, and his son, Henry Bolingbroke, overthrew the tyrant king, claiming the throne for himself. I mean, after all, he is the grandson of Edward III. John of Gaunt should have been king anyway. The crown is his. But as for Richard II, well, we don't know, but he was possibly slung in a prison and starved to death. He was certainly dead in the year 1399, meaning Henry IV, the new king, Bolingbroke, now took the kingdom into the 15th century. Henry IV will reign for around 14 years, passing the crown to his own son, Henry V of Agincourt fame, once more into the breach. As yes, the 100 Years' War is still raging on through the early part of the 15th century. In fact, it will go on until the mid-15th century. Now, King Henry V has only one child, also Henry, and he will inherit the throne in 1422. Yeah, about that, because Henry VI is just a baby. He's not even a year old, probably about 8 or 9 months. It's not like he's running the country anytime soon. Well, we are in a regency government, the kingdom being ruled pretty much by Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who, unlike John of Gaunt, who saw his power grabbed by a despot, well, Duke of Gloucester seems to be the despot, and we're heading into War of the Roses territory here. But turning our focus back to fine old Salisbury, during the 15th century, we'll see the city undergo quite a lot of changes, and some are with us today. This is the house of John a Port, built in 1425 at what was then called Lion Exchequer. Now it's called Queen Street, and it's adjacent to a house that belonged to William Russell. The 2 linked houses are the oldest remaining civilian houses in the city and have everything you'd expect from a house of this period. It's got the pointed roof, it's got the classic old-fashioned timbers, everything. Now, John a Port himself was a successful merchant, and apparently also mayor on a number of occasions. And apparently he was also quite a nasty piece of work. Now, at the time I visited, it was a clothing shop, crew clothing, so I got to take a look around. There's an old fireplace, built with chalk blocks, and it boasts the merchant's mark of John a Port. But alas, recently, said company appears to have moved or folded, as of 2025. It is no longer there. The Guild of Tailors were quite prominent in the city, and appear to have quite some sway. Do remember that tailors made up for around 10% of Salisbury's population. And that chap that lived next to John a Port, William Russell, well, his other neighbour is Edward Goodyear, a master tailor and prominent member of this tailors' guild. So we're already getting a feel of the local community. These three men, John, William and Edward, would have known each other very well. The Tailors' Guild appears to have originally been far north of the city, based at the Church of St Edmunds. It's quite a walk beyond Market Ward, so it makes sense that they would relocate further south, into Market Ward, to St Thomas's Church in fact. This is in 1449. And incidentally, the church was being rebuilt yet again the previous year in 1448, having recently collapsed. It's now looking more like the church we know. And the Poultry Cross is also rebuilt around 1450, and also is pretty much now looking like the one we see today. I say pretty much, it goes through one more final change during the Victorian age, but we'll get to that in the sixth part of this series. However, on a serious note, there was growing dissent from the people around this time, due to government corruption and general abuses of power. What's more, that baby king. He's now around 30 years of age, but he's prone to bouts of mental illness. He's also claimed the crown of France. But yeah, the French couldn't give a toss. They don't care. The 100 Years' War is running to a close, and England isn't winning. It's been 20 years since Joan of Arc was a bit of a minx, and the war only got worse from there. And this year, in 1450, the English lost the battle at Formigny. It's been quite a busy year. All of this, plus a whole host of other factors, elevated public anger, led by a chap by the name of Jack Cade. And he rose up with an angry mob that marched onto London. Jack Cade would inevitably lose his life in a skirmish at London Bridge, but our concern is Salisbury. As in 1450, yes, it's a very busy year, riots were breaking out all around this usually peaceful city. On top of all the other gripes, the textile industry has taken a hit, sparking civil disobedience. With anger directed at the government, the mob descends upon the Bishop of Salisbury, William Ascough, and slew him in cold blood. Most likely because he was a good friend of the king. This is the chap that oversaw the marriage of the king. Now slain by an enraged mob. And once the riots had calmed down, we can only imagine that those behind the murder were tried and hanged. Most likely the Market Square. And Richard Beauchamp would take over as bishop that year, and he'd hold the position for about 30 years. But the unrest would only get worse, because in 1453, English forces in France are all but annihilated at the Battle of Castillon, ending the long drawn-out 100 Years' War. This loss causes King Henry to have a mental breakdown, forcing one of his magnates, Richard, Duke of York, to take control of the kingdom. And when the king snaps out of this mental state, A year later, he's not happy. And another war breaks out as he tries to regain his throne. The War of the Roses, York versus Lancaster, a bitter war indeed. Right, on to more better subjects, because in the 1450s we can return our gaze to the haunch of venison, which is an old church house. Because in 1458, next to this old church house was a barber surgeon shop ran by John Winchester. But he had recently died, so his widow, Agnes, left it to the provost of St Edmund's Church, the one far north of town. And a provost, by the way, is the head of a college of learning. And in this case, it was a man by the name of John Pyville. There you go. Now, back to the War of the Roses, because without going into too much detail, King Henry VI is warring with his magnate, Richard, Duke of York, also a relative with a lineage going back to Edward III. Now, the Earl of Salisbury is previously loyal to Henry, and he switches his fealty to Richard. He's actually made Lord Chancellor. But in 1460, Salisbury is defeated at Wakefield and flees to Pontefract Castle, where he is captured and beheaded. Now, his son then takes the title of Earl of Salisbury, and this son is none other than Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick. He's the kingmaker. Now the war is really kicking off. Because it wasn't just Salisbury who died after the Battle of Wakefield. Richard, Duke of York, was also killed during the melee itself, and this leaves his son, Edward, as leader of the Yorkist faction, smashing the Lancaster forces at the Battle of Telton, taking the throne as Edward IV. We have a bit of a to and fro going on as Henry regains the throne, then Edward takes it back at the Battle of Barnet. A bugger is, Warwick the Kingmaker, aka Earl of Salisbury, was slain in the battle, and all of a sudden we're in the 1470s. But there is another contender rising in the shadows. King Edward's son, another Richard, another Duke of York. This actually brings Salisbury back into play one more time, though not the Earl. I'm referring to the city. But if you are interested, with Warwick dead, the title Earl is in a state of flux. It is given to the Duke of Clarence, but he's executed in 1478. It then goes to Edward of Middleham, but he's a small child who just happened to be the son of this new Duke of York, Richard. Anyway, the city of Salisbury. But first, I'll introduce another kingmaker, because we're more concerned with the man pretty much behind this new Richard's rise to power, and this is Henry Stafford, the Duke of Buckingham, very much a kingmaker, and I'll explain a bit more. Because you have the princes in the Tower. Richard of York is supposed to look after these two as they are heirs to the throne, the sons of Edward IV, who have passed away in 1483. And these two boys are kept in a tower, and they are never seen again. And with these two out of the way, the Duke of York is now set to take the throne as Richard III in 1483. Yes, it's very dodgy. This is much like the controversy with King John and William the Brewers. You've got Richard and Buckingham are linked forever in this. Possible partners in crime. We'll never know. There is so much going on here I couldn't possibly detail it all. And Buckingham may have had nothing to do with it. But he certainly did have a hand in making Richard III king, and that could not be achieved if the two boys were alive. And later that year, the Duke of Buckingham leads a revolt against his king. A sizable rebellion that proved a serious threat, until it fell apart, nearly a month later. Buckingham fled to Shropshire, where he was captured. Then Buckingham was taken to Salisbury, where he was tried and found guilty of treason. And on the 2nd of November, 1483, Buckingham was led to the market square and publicly beheaded. And it wouldn't be long until King Richard III also met his maker at the Battle of Bosworth Field, where he is defeated by another rebellion, by a new king, Henry Tudor, Henry VII. But now we're getting into the early part of the Renaissance, and we'll cover that in the next video, part 4 of the series.